we finally leave the stories of all of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, leading up to the story of Joseph. Now in the second book of Torah, the first parsha, which is called Shmot, we now begin to discover the entire people of Israel being born. This is no longer the story of single individuals, but the story of a nationhood, which is why this week's Torah reading begins a series of very complex ideas that require our attention and require a lot of investigation to determine its worth, its value, its need to us for our identity to this very day. So, let's begin. The Torah reading starts out with the Pharaoh no longer recognizing that there is a good people that lives amongst the Egyptian people. In fact, the way that it is described is that the nation of Hebrews that lives in Egypt is almost swarming. In fact, this exact same word that's used for swarming animals that God creates in the very first chapters of Genesis are the same words that are used to describe the Jewish people here. Vayishritzu, and they literally swarmed out of the ground. This was the attitude that the Egyptians took as they saw the Jewish people multiplying and becoming a mighty force among them. They were frightened, they were scared. And what was the reaction of the Jewish people? The reaction of the Jewish people was they saw this, and we view it, as an act of hatred, an act of anti-Semitism. And any time anti-Semitism has reared its head throughout the pages of history, we have become catalyzed by that, propelled into action, forced, as it were, by the inhumanity of humanity. Does it require hatred in order for us to realize who we are? Do we require an enemy to make us understand better what we were born to, what our identity is supposed to be? Are we supposed to become galvanized by the things that are noxious in this world? Do we pray when we are needful? Do we pray when we're in the hospital? Do we pray when our legs have been cut out from under us? Are those the times that we become the most needful and therefore the most religious? If it works on an individual level, does it not also work the same way on a national level? Do we as Jews become fortified when our anti-Semites of the world tell us it is time to become fortified? One major idea that is found in the book of Genesis is that the Jewish people were told by God that they would be slaves in Egypt for 400 years. However, looking at the parsha closely, we realize that did not happen. That the Jewish nation was enslaved in Egypt for 215 years. Why the shortfall? Why the difference? It wasn't mere compassion, say our sages, not simply the compassion of God that was tired of hearing the whips and the cries of his people, but more so that his people, God's nation in Israel, was becoming too much like the oppressor's will. They had accepted the fact that they were Untermenschen, that they were less than human. They were coming around to the understanding that in order to be good Egyptians, they needed to cast off the yoke of their faith, needed to be more like their surroundings. In fact, this interpretation jibes quite well with our understanding of how the people of the world that hate us most keep us most Jewish. Think of what that means. Think of the implications of that thought. That we get our identity negatively? That we become who we are because people hate us? In the story of Exodus, God hears the trampled cries of the Jewish people that are being ground underfoot. They are being ground into the dust. And Midrash Rabbah says that the souls of the Jewish people were so afflicted that they were literally being ground into the earth. It is at that moment that God decides to redeem his people. Do we get our cues from this story? Do we understand our theology, our relationship to God from this story, that every time we cry out when we're desperate needs, God responds? If so, that's the wrong lesson to be taking out of this. To wait until the moments become so disastrous that our identity and our vitality and our very lives are at stake before we begin to call out to God, that is a terrible theological idea. Every master that's ever existed, every teacher that has ever professed, every Jewish person that has risen to the pinnacle of Jewish learning has said the same thing. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. That where we are supposed to find God is in the kernel of joy, in the moment of finding God in the midst of goodness, not in the bowels of pain. This story is a powerful one, and it should become the locus for our personal identity. It should become the linchpin for everything that we believe and know about ourselves personally, communally, nationally. That where we find ourselves proximate to God is not at the depths of despair, not as we're being grounded to the earth, but with a sense of joy, with a sense of purpose, with a sense of hope. This does make all the difference in the world. Shabbat Shalom.